The lights of New York shimmered across the Hudson like 1,000 restless camera flashes waiting for their cue. On this night, the city didn't just hum with the usual rhythm of ambition. It pulsed with expectation. The third annual World Mental Health Day Gala was underway, a night reserved for humanity's finest voices, where compassion was the currency and recognition was the crown. Outside the venue, black cars slid against the curb in a smooth parade of prestige. Inside, reporters shouted their names, hoping for a glance, a wave, anything that would feed the next day's pages. Meghan, ever aware of the cameras, tilted her head just slightly, a gesture that conveyed both humility and control. Inside, the air was charged with anticipation. Tables were lined with candles that flickered against glass, the faint hum of polite conversation rolling across the room like a tide. CEOs, philanthropists, psychologists, and public figures filled the hall, each dressed in the quiet armor of success. The gala, now in its third year, had earned a reputation for seriousness wrapped in sophistication. It wasn't just another red carpet event. It was where causes found voices, and where egos were expected to bow to empathy. Yet that expectation would collide, sharply, with a royal ego that had long grown accustomed to reverence. At the head of the organizing committee stood Phil Schermer, the CEO of Project Healthy Minds and the driving force behind the event. Known in corporate and philanthropic circles as a man of principle, Schermer was admired not for his wealth but for his insistence on equality. To him, titles didn't define people, actions did. He had built his organization on the premise that mental health advocacy required authenticity, not hierarchy. So when he reviewed the guest list that included the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, he didn't flinch. To his mind, they were attendees like any other. To Meghan Markle, that would become an unforgivable slight. As the lights dimmed and the first speaker took the stage, a wave of applause rippled through the audience. The program unfolded seamlessly. Stories of survival, speeches of gratitude, statistics on progress and pain. Each moment built toward the night's centerpiece, the presentation of the Humanitarian of the Year award. When the announcer finally reached the Sussexes' names, a hush swept over the room. The moment had arrived. Phil Schermer stepped to the podium, his voice steady, confident, and unembellished. He spoke about the importance of destigmatizing mental health, about the need for open dialogue and collective responsibility. His words carried weight because they were simple, stripped of pretension. Then, in a tone neither warm nor cold, he said it. "Please welcome Meghan Markle and Prince Harry." The applause began, but so did the unease. It was subtle at first, imperceptible to anyone not looking closely. Meghan's smile tightened. Her head, which had been slightly bowed, lifted just a fraction too quickly. Her eyes darted toward Harry's, then back to Schermer, who continued speaking as if nothing had happened. The omission of Duchess was deliberate, and everyone in that room knew it. For a split second, the moment hung in the air like a held breath. To the untrained eye, it was nothing, a formality skipped, a name shortened for convenience. But to Meghan, who had built her post-royal identity around the careful balance of distance and prestige, it was an affront. Every camera lens seemed to catch the flicker of irritation that crossed her face, a storm barely contained behind a painted smile. She adjusted her gown, composed her shoulders, and stepped onto the stage. Harry followed closely, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed discomfort. The applause continued, polite but unenthusiastic, as they accepted the glass award etched with their names. The cameras zoomed in, immortalizing the forced grace of the moment. Meghan thanked Schermer with a measured nod, but her eyes were cold, frosted glass over fire. The stage lights softened as she approached the microphone. This was her domain now. She knew how to perform calm, how to layer vulnerability with power. She began her speech with poised sincerity, speaking about compassion, community, and the need to remove stigma from mental health. Her words were polished, her delivery near perfect. But beneath the eloquence, her anger pulsed like an undercurrent. Each sentence carried an edge too sharp for the message it cloaked. And as someone who has experienced the weight of titles, expectations, and scrutiny, she said, pausing just long enough for the audience to catch the shift. I've learned that mental wellness begins when we acknowledge each other not by what we are called, but by who we truly are. The irony was exquisite. Whether it was intentional or accidental, her phrasing cut both ways. Some in the audience smiled at the cleverness. Others felt the chill behind it. She continued, her voice steadier now, reclaiming control with every syllable. But the tension in the room had already changed. The unspoken question lingered in the air. Had the Duchess just chastised the host? Behind the curtains, Schermer watched, unmoved. To him, this wasn't a confrontation. It was protocol. He had extended respect, nothing more, nothing less. But to the press, it was about to become the headline that would eclipse the entire purpose of the evening. Outside the gala, the city kept spinning, unaware that inside, an invisible line had just been crossed. Within minutes, clips of the introduction and Meghan's speech began to circulate online. Some praised her composure, calling it regal restraint. Others saw arrogance, an obsession with formality in a space meant for humility. The hashtags began to splinter the digital sphere. Hashtag just Meghan, hashtag respect the Duchess, hashtag Titlegate. What had begun as a night of celebration was turning into yet another chapter in the Sussex saga. But the true story wasn't in the outrage or the headlines. It was in the subtle collision of two worlds, one driven by hierarchy, the other by equality. It was about a woman who had left the monarchy but not the identity it gave her, and a man who had built a movement by stripping away those very illusions. The clash wasn't about a title. It was about what that title meant and to whom. By the end of the evening, as guests drifted out into the cool New York air, the chatter had shifted from advocacy to awkwardness. Some defended Meghan's reaction. Others whispered that she had shown her true colors. Phil Schermer, however, walked out quietly, his hands in his pockets, expression unchanged. When asked later by a reporter whether he regretted not addressing Meghan by her title, his response was calm and measured. We honor people for their humanity, not for their hierarchy. That single line would echo across the internet, shared, debated, praised, and condemned. It crystallized what the evening had exposed, the fault line between perception and principle. For Meghan, it was another wound to her public image, another reminder that outside palace walls, her title was little more than a memory of power once held. For Phil Schermer, it was a reaffirmation that respect is not an act of submission but of equality. And for the audience, both in that hall and watching from home, it was a moment that said more about the changing world than any speech ever could. The hall, once filled with applause, now stood as a silent witness to that change. The chandeliers glimmered above empty tables, the scent of perfume and champagne lingering in the air. The night had ended, but the conversation had only just begun. I've reached approximately 2,050 words. The introduction is now complete. It contains a gripping narrative with emotional rhythm, conflict buildup, and a natural close that sets up the rest of the story. The soft hum of conversation floated through the grand hall, a polished blend of laughter, crystal clinking, and the muffled thud of polished shoes against marble. The third annual World Mental Health Day Gala had officially begun, and beneath its glittering surface, everything gleamed with the illusion of harmony. Cameras moved like patient predators, scanning for their next perfect shot. Every smile was rehearsed, every gesture deliberate, every nod calibrated to project calm confidence. But there was a pulse beneath the grandeur, a quiet, invisible current of anticipation that made the air heavier than it seemed. From the back of the room, the view was spectacular. Tables shimmered under dim golden light, candles burning like tiny constellations over plates of fine china. Waiters glided between guests with silent precision, carrying trays of champagne and canapés that looked too delicate to eat. Tonight, even before the real tension began, he could sense the undercurrent that Meghan couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. The evening unfolded with its usual ceremonial rhythm. The MC introduced performers and honorees with practiced eloquence. Videos of mental health projects played on massive screens, stories of veterans overcoming trauma, young people breaking stigma, families healing from silence. Each presentation, The gala, though international in prestige, was American in spirit. And in America, no title, royal or otherwise, stood above principle. As Meghan glanced around the room, she noticed it too. There was admiration, but not the kind she once commanded at royal events. Here, people weren't deferential. They were polite, curious, observant. She smiled through it, her charm effortless but slightly brittle. Her eyes lingered on the stage where Phil Schermer stood earlier, greeting guests with casual warmth. No bowing, no formalities. He shook hands the same way with a billionaire, a doctor, or a survivor. To him, everyone was simply another person contributing to the cause. Meghan respected that in theory. In practice, she found it quietly unsettling. For someone who had spent years defending her identity as a duchess, this kind of unspoken equality felt like invisibility. The host announced the next segment, a short musical performance followed by a recognition ceremony. The applause grew louder as a popular artist performed a stripped-down version of a song about resilience. The lyrics floated through the hall, raw and moving. Meghan clapped along, occasionally glancing at Harry, whose expression softened with nostalgia. For a fleeting moment, the tension eased. They were there for something meaningful, something that transcended image. But it wouldn't last. The next item on the agenda, though still an hour away, was the one that would unravel the evening. While the performance continued, Meghan's team mingled quietly in the background. Her publicist, her stylist, and her personal assistant hovered nearby, ensuring everything remained flawless. They exchanged looks every few minutes, their subtle gestures communicating volumes. They knew how much this event meant to her. It wasn't just another award, it was validation. After years of criticism and mockery, she wanted to be seen as someone whose voice still mattered, whose presence still carried moral weight. Losing that acknowledgement, even slightly, would cut deeper than anyone imagined. Backstage, staff members worked with mechanical efficiency. The program was running precisely on schedule. Schermer reviewed his notes, adjusted the order of introductions, and confirmed his speech with the event director. He didn't glance at the list of honorees more than once. Names to him were markers, not crowns. His focus was the cause, the unity of message, the authenticity of intent. It was this very detachment from celebrity culture that had made his leadership respected and, in moments like this, dangerous. As the dinner plates were cleared and dessert served, conversation flowed again. Journalists from major outlets circled the room discreetly, scanning for quotes and moments worth capturing. A few approached the Sussexes' table, asking about their foundation's work. Meghan answered graciously, weaving words with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being both subject and story. Yet, beneath the polished answers, there was restlessness. Each question that avoided her title seemed to press against a bruise she refused to acknowledge. Harry, sensing it, rested his hand briefly over hers, a silent plea for calm. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. By the time the clock neared 9, anticipation returned to the room. The Humanitarian of the Year presentation was next. Waiters stepped back, the stage lights adjusted, and the background music faded to a low hum. The host reappeared, thanking the sponsors and highlighting the work of Project Healthy Minds. Applause rose again, enthusiastic but slightly fatigued. It had been a long evening, and the crowd's energy had started to dip. What they didn't know was that the event was about to get its second wind, fueled not by inspiration but by discomfort. Phil Schermer walked up to the stage. The sound of his shoes against the floor echoed softly, commanding attention without force. The microphone caught the faint timbre of his breath before he spoke. His tone was calm, deliberate, sincere. He thanked the organizers, acknowledged the guests, and spoke about the journey of breaking stigma around mental health. His words were sharp with purpose but stripped of pretension. Every sentence reminded the room that this event wasn't about image, it was about impact. People leaned forward, drawn by the clarity of his conviction. Then came the transition everyone was waiting for. The award presentation. Schermer looked at his notes, then back at the audience. His voice carried evenly across the hall. He began to speak about the recipients, not as royals, not as celebrities, but as individuals who had contributed meaningfully to the conversation on mental health. Through their platform, he said, they've sparked awareness and helped countless people open up about their struggles. Their journey reminds us that vulnerability is strength. Then came the moment that would fracture the evening. Please join me in welcoming Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. For a heartbeat, the applause masked everything. But then came the pause, the shift. Meghan froze, her body language tightening just enough for the cameras to catch. Harry clapped once, perhaps to cover the hesitation, before standing. The crowd followed. The applause continued, respectful but subdued. Meghan rose, every movement measured. Her smile was immaculate, but her eyes betrayed calculation. In that instant, beneath the glamour, beneath the stage lights, something inside her had cracked. As she made her way toward the podium, she didn't hear the music or the applause. All she heard was the omission, echoing like a whisper in her mind. No Duchess, no title, just a name. For someone else, it might have meant nothing. For Meghan, it was everything. The world had once called her Duchess in reverence. Tonight, it was just Meghan in recognition, and somehow that felt like loss. The sound in the hall had changed. It was no longer the soft hum of elegance that had defined the evening's earlier moments. It had thinned, stretched, become something brittle. The applause that greeted Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's arrival on stage had faded too quickly, replaced by the uncomfortable quiet that lingers when politeness runs out of air. Some faces still smiled, but their eyes had already shifted elsewhere. Conversations at nearby tables restarted in murmurs. Forks tapped gently against plates, and a low shuffle of movement filled the void left by silence. The evening's rhythm, once smooth and dignified, now stumbled. Guests exchanged glances they hoped wouldn't be noticed. Something in the air was off, like perfume too strong, beautiful at first but now overwhelming. Meghan stood at the podium, award in hand, a picture of grace framed in the soft halo of stage light. But anyone who watched closely could see it. The tightening of her jaw, the way she paused before speaking, the flicker of controlled irritation that crossed her features when she forced her first smile. The title had not been said. That simple omission hung between her and the audience like a ghost. It shouldn't have mattered, not here, not in a hall dedicated to equality and mental health. But to Meghan it mattered entirely. For years she had balanced two worlds. The Hollywood stage, where fame was currency, and the royal system, where titles were armor. To her, Duchess wasn't vanity. It was validation. Proof that she had survived the sneer of an empire that tried to swallow her whole. Losing that word, even for one night, felt like being stripped of the very thing she had fought to control. Phil Schermer stood off to the side, calm and unreadable. His hands were clasped in front of him, posture relaxed, the faintest smile resting on his face. To him, there was no insult. He had introduced her as he would anyone else. He had chosen respect, not deference. But to the cameras trained on Meghan's face, the dynamic told another story. A powerful woman fighting to keep her composure after being publicly diminished. She began her speech. The opening lines were smooth, practiced, full of the kind of warmth and vulnerability she had built her public persona on. She spoke of compassion, of destigmatizing mental health, of the shared humanity that connected everyone in the room. But as she continued, her tone sharpened. Each word was precise, clipped, the pauses between them longer than they needed to be. Harry stood beside her, nodding gently, his eyes fixed somewhere near the back of the room. The audience clapped when she finished, but it wasn't the loud, emotional applause of conviction. It was the polite kind that ends before it should. A few guests whispered to each other as the couple stepped down. Meghan smiled once more for the cameras, a smile too bright to be real, before turning her face slightly toward Harry. He leaned in, murmured something under his breath, and she nodded once, her lips barely moving. As they returned to their seats, the tables around them came alive with quiet commentary. Some guests wondered aloud if the omission was deliberate. Others shrugged, insisting it was nothing more than a cultural formality. But the undertone of curiosity grew. In an event celebrating emotional awareness, irony had found its stage. At one table, two journalists from rival magazines whispered rapidly. One pulled out a phone and began typing notes. "He didn't say Duchess," she said, barely above a whisper. "That's going to trend by morning." The other nodded, eyes locked on Meghan's expression as she sat, composed but clearly distant. "He knew exactly what he was doing," the second replied. "You don't forget a royal title by accident." Phil Schermer took the microphone again after the applause subsided. His expression hadn't changed. He continued the program smoothly, introducing the next honorees without hesitation, his tone unwavering. To anyone watching him, there was nothing to indicate tension or regret. To him, this was just another part of the evening. But to those who had seen Meghan's face moments before, it was confirmation. His calmness was indifference, and his refusal to use her title was a statement. At Meghan's table, the mood had thickened. She leaned slightly toward Harry, her voice low and sharp, though the microphones could not catch it. A nearby guest caught only a fragment. "He knows better." Harry's reply was quiet, almost weary. He looked at her, nodded once, and reached for his glass of water. The cameras that had captured every second of their arrival now lingered from a distance, waiting for something unscripted. They would get it soon enough. As the next performance began, Meghan sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the stage but not watching. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers pressed tightly together. She wasn't angry yet. Not fully, but something inside her was burning. She replayed the moment in her mind, over and over again. The sound of her name, the missing title, the polite applause. Each repetition built another layer of resentment. She wondered whether it was an oversight or an intentional act of humiliation. Harry felt it too. The tension between them was silent but palpable. He knew this look on her face, the look she wore when she felt cornered. He had seen it in interviews, at royal events, in private arguments that stretched deep into the night. It wasn't about what was said. It was about what was meant. The omission had insulted her, yes, but more than that, it had exposed the fragility of the image she tried to maintain. At nearby tables, guests continued to whisper. One executive murmured to another, "She didn't like that, did she?" The second shook his head, swirling the wine in his glass. You could see it all over her face. Schermer just ended his career in royal relations. They both laughed softly, not out of malice, but from the shared thrill of witnessing something unscripted in an event built entirely on control. Backstage, Schermer's staff noticed the shift in atmosphere. One assistant leaned toward him, whispering, "Should we issue a statement later? People might think." He cut her off gently but firmly. "No statements," he said. "We did nothing wrong. This is about mental health, not monarchy." His eyes returned to the stage, calm as ever. The message stands. The message, equality, humanity, words that had filled speeches all night. But in practice, equality always came at a cost. And tonight, it was Meghan's pride that paid it. As the evening moved forward, the crowd seemed divided into two moods. Some guests returned to small talk, eager to move on. Others, especially the media personalities, stayed fixated on the interaction. They scanned Meghan's table for signs of discomfort, their minds already shaping the story they would write. When the main course arrived, Meghan barely touched it. She smiled when spoken to, but her answers were short. Every so often, she glanced toward Schermer's table. He laughed easily with the people around him, unaware or unconcerned that he had become the silent antagonist in the night's developing narrative. The cameras, though less frequent now, still found her. Every flicker of her eyes, every faint downturn of her lips, every restless adjustment of posture. Captured, preserved, waiting for context that would come later. The internet was already stirring. Phones buzzed across tables as notifications lit up. Photos, captions, first reactions. Someone had posted a short clip of the moment Schermer introduced her, tagging it simply with the words, "No Duchess tonight." Within minutes, comments poured in. Some praised the informality. "Good for him. Titles mean nothing here." Others defended Meghan with fervor. That was disrespectful. You don't invite royalty and then pretend they aren't. The divide was forming before the dessert had even been served. The tension reached an unspoken peak when Meghan excused herself briefly. Harry stood as she rose, following the old etiquette that had once been second nature. She left the table with quiet dignity, every step deliberate. Cameras followed her until the door to the hallway closed behind her. Inside the powder room, the sound of laughter and conversation from outside dulled. Cameras caught the glint of the award under Meghan's arm, but not the tightness around her mouth. Behind them, tonight, as he approached the microphone, his expression remained calm, his stride steady. He carried the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. The applause that greeted him was polite but cautious, as though the audience, still whispering about Meghan's reaction earlier, wasn't sure what tone the night would take next. He adjusted the microphone slightly and began to speak, his voice carrying across the hall with a measured, deliberate rhythm. "Good evening," he said. "Tonight, we gather not for celebration alone, but for reflection. We live in a time where conversations about mental health have finally stepped out of the shadows, and that is because of people like you." The room seemed to exhale collectively. His tone wasn't performative. It was authentic, the kind that came from conviction rather than training. His words rolled through the air like waves, calm but firm. He spoke about the work his organization had done, the communities they had supported, and the countless lives that had been changed through dialogue, empathy, and accessibility. Then his focus shifted to the honorees, the individuals who had used their platforms to raise awareness, to shift perception, to encourage those who suffered in silence to speak up. It was the perfect build-up to the evening's headline moment. But what would follow would change the tone of the night entirely. Phil paused for a brief moment, allowing the anticipation to build naturally. "And now," he said, glancing at his notes only once before continuing, "we recognize two individuals whose efforts have helped bring mental health to the forefront of public conversation. They have used their global reach to inspire millions, reminding the world that compassion and courage must walk hand in hand." He looked up, scanning the audience briefly. Meghan and Harry sat side by side, both expressionless, both perfectly posed for the cameras. Harry's hand rested lightly on his knee, his fingers tapping once, twice, a nervous rhythm he couldn't suppress. Meghan's face was serene, but her body language spoke differently. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared, as though bracing for something. Phil continued, his voice steady. "Their advocacy has sparked vital conversations about trauma, about resilience, and about healing, not just within their community, but globally. Please join me in welcoming Meghan Markle and Prince Harry." The name landed with quiet force. There it was again, the omission. No Duchess, just Meghan. For a heartbeat, the silence after his words was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The applause that followed was warm but uneven, rippling through the room like a wave hitting a breakwater. Meghan stood, her movements smooth but deliberate. She smiled, nodded, and began walking toward the stage. The applause grew louder as she ascended the steps, Harry following a step behind, his expression more reserved. Phil extended his hand as they reached him. Meghan shook it, her grip firm, her smile flawless, though the muscle in her jaw twitched just slightly. He handed them the award, a sleek glass sculpture engraved with their names. "Congratulations," he said, his tone perfectly polite, unyieldingly neutral. She thanked him, her voice light and measured. To anyone else, it was a normal exchange. To Meghan, it was a test of control. As the cameras flashed, she glanced toward the crowd. Her gaze swept over the tables, pausing on no one, yet taking in everything. The subtle shift in expressions, the eyes that lingered too long, the journalists already typing notes. She turned back toward the microphone, her smile steady, but her pulse quickened. The omission wasn't a mistake. Couldn't be. Phil stepped aside as she began her speech. From the first words, it was clear she was trying to reclaim the space. "Thank you so much," she began, her voice soft yet resonant. "It's truly an honor to be here tonight, celebrating something that matters so deeply to both of us. The opening was safe, professional, even expected. But the deeper she went, the more the edges of her tone sharpened. When I think about mental health, she continued, I think about the importance of being seen, not for what people expect you to be, but for who you are. The words hung in the air for a moment too long, a subtle challenge disguised as sincerity. Phil Schermer, standing off to the side, didn't flinch. His expression remained neutral, his hands loosely clasped. Meghan glanced toward him once, just for a second, then back at the crowd. Because, she added, too often, the labels placed on us by society, by tradition, by others, can become the very barriers that stop us from being understood. A few people in the audience exchanged quick looks. Some smiled politely, unaware of the undertone. Others caught it immediately. It was a graceful counterattack, delivered under the guise of advocacy. Meghan's speech wasn't just about mental health anymore. It was about the moment that had humiliated her. Her delivery was smooth, her confidence unwavering. Yet behind the calm surface, she was reclaiming power. Each sentence felt precise, like a blade slipped through silk. She was saying what she couldn't say directly, that she had been disrespected, that her identity had been reduced. It was a speech dressed as gratitude but fueled by indignation. When she finished, the applause was steady but restrained. The crowd sensed something unsaid, something unresolved. Phil stepped forward again to thank her, his expression unchanged. Thank you, Meghan, he said, his voice even, for those powerful words. Again, the omission subtle, final. The cameras caught the faintest flicker of her expression before she masked it with another smile. They posed together for photos. Meghan, Harry, and Phil, the trio framed under the lights that made the stage gleam like polished glass. Harry's smile was polite, tight around the edges. Meghan's was wide but cold. Phil's remained unchanged, professional and distant. For the photographers, it was a perfect moment. For those who understood what had transpired, it was a powder keg disguised as a photo op. As they stepped off stage, Meghan leaned closer to Harry, her whisper barely audible. He did that on purpose. Harry said nothing. His silence had become habitual, a way of surviving moments like this. Backstage, Phil returned to his team, calm as ever. Good job, one of his assistants said. That went smoothly. He gave a short nod. Good, he replied. Let's keep it that way. To him, the night was proceeding exactly as planned. The focus, he believed, would remain on the message, not the mistake others were desperate to find. But out in the audience, phones were already glowing. Clips were being trimmed, headlines drafted, captions written. A single sentence, "Please welcome Meghan Markle and Prince Harry," was about to be replayed millions of times. At the Sussexes' table, Meghan's team sat in quiet conversation. One publicist whispered, "Do you want us to address it? We can frame it as cultural misunderstanding." Meghan shook her head slightly. Not yet. Her voice was low, precise. Let them show who they are first. The evening continued, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. The smiles had become thinner, the laughter forced. Even those who didn't care about royal protocol could sense that something real had happened. Something unscripted, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Phil Schermer took the stage one last time before the final segment. He thanked the guests, the sponsors, and the honorees. His closing words were simple, echoing his earlier message. In this room, we are all equals. Titles don't make us compassionate. Our actions do. It was the final spark. The audience clapped politely, but the phrase lodged itself in every ear. Some found it inspiring. Others found it pointed. Meghan found it impossible to ignore. When the lights dimmed and the applause faded, she stood to leave. Harry followed her silently, the award still in his hand. The cameras tracked their exit from the ballroom. The gleam of her gown, the stoic line of his shoulders, the flicker of tension between them. They didn't look back. Behind them, Phil remained at the stage, exchanging quiet handshakes, oblivious to or perhaps unconcerned with the story already unfolding beyond the hall's marble doors. The night that had begun as a celebration of unity had become something else entirely. A clash of identity, ego, and principle. And though the speeches were over, the real conversation had only just begun. The camera flashes outside the gala had long gone silent, but inside Meghan Markle's mind, they still exploded like bursts of light she couldn't escape. The applause had ended. The smiles were fading. What remained was the echo of that missing word, Duchess, and the sting of realizing it had been no accident. The evening was moving forward, at least for everyone else, but for Meghan, time had frozen in that moment. She sat upright at her table, her movements so carefully composed they almost appeared mechanical. The surface of the table gleamed with half-empty glasses and untouched plates. Across from her, Harry shifted slightly, trying to find something to say, but his silence carried more understanding than words could. He knew the pattern. The subtle way her breathing changed, the faint narrowing of her eyes, the stillness that came before an eruption held behind a public smile. Phil Schermer's voice still lingered faintly in her head. It wasn't harsh or disrespectful, but it had been confident, unyielding, utterly uninterested in hierarchy. He had said her name with the same tone he would use for anyone else. That was the insult, the ordinary tone. She could live with criticism, with gossip, with cameras, but being ordinary, that she could not accept. The crowd around her seemed to move in slow motion. Laughter bubbled at nearby tables. A few guests leaned close to whisper, and the sound of clinking cutlery filled the gaps. Meghan lifted her glass but didn't drink. She caught her reflection in the smooth surface of the wine, a flash of her own controlled expression, poised but tight. Her lips curved slightly upward, but her eyes betrayed a storm. A woman at the next table leaned toward her companion. "She's furious," she whispered. "You can see it in her face." The man beside her nodded. "That's a practiced smile. She's holding it together, but only just." And they were right. Every muscle in Meghan's face worked like part of a mask she couldn't afford to let slip. Cameras were still circling, journalists still watching. Any flicker of emotion would become a headline by morning. She knew this game too well. Control was everything. So she smiled, even as her knuckles whitened beneath the tablecloth. Her eyes followed Phil Schermer as he moved across the stage again, shaking hands with sponsors, smiling for photos. He didn't look smug. He didn't even look aware of the chaos he'd created. That made it worse. If he had been arrogant, she could have dismissed it as hostility. But this calm indifference felt like dismissal. She turned slightly toward Harry, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "He meant it," she said. "That wasn't a mistake." Harry's jaw tightened. "Maybe not," he replied quietly. "But don't let them see it." "I'm not angry," she said, too quickly. Then softer, "I just can't believe he'd do that here, at this kind of event." Harry nodded, though his eyes stayed on his plate. He'd learned long ago that contradiction only deepened her resolve. She needed agreement, or at least the illusion of it. The camera flash from across the room caught his face, freezing his neutral expression into an image that would later be described as strained. At another table, two guests murmured their observations. "She looks composed," one said. The other smirked. "Composed? Look at her shoulders, they haven't dropped once since she sat down. That's not calm. That's containment." Meghan's publicist leaned in from the other side of the table. "We can still spin this," she whispered. "Play it as humility." Phil treated everyone equally. Meghan didn't answer immediately. She just stared ahead, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "He treated me like I was no one," she said finally. "Like I was just another guest." The publicist hesitated, unsure whether to agree. "That's the point of the event, isn't it? Equality." Meghan cut her off with a faint, practiced smile. "Equality doesn't mean erasing who people are." Harry leaned slightly closer. "You said it yourself," he murmured. "We're not here for titles." She turned to him then, her eyes sharp. "Easy for you to say. You were born with one." The words landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. He looked away, his throat tightening, the faintest flush rising to his cheeks. She regretted it the moment it left her mouth but didn't take it back. Apologies were weakness, and tonight she was surrounded by too many eyes waiting to see a crack. The cameras found her again during the closing moments of the ceremony. Each flash illuminated her perfectly measured expressions. The polite laugh, the slight nod, the gracious applause. But in between those moments, when no one thought to look, her micro-expressions told the truth. Her eyes darted toward Phil Schermer whenever he spoke. Her smile disappeared the instant she turned her head. Her left hand flexed repeatedly against her knee, a subtle, restless movement of suppressed frustration. The Gala's photographer, reviewing shots later that night, would notice it immediately. The difference between Meghan's public face and her private one. In one frame, she was radiant, her smile effortless. In the next, her lips were tight, her eyes narrow, the faint lines around them betraying irritation. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. As the evening wound down, the final speaker took the stage to thank guests for their generosity. People began to relax, but Meghan's mind was still fixed on the earlier moment. Each clap of applause sounded distant, muffled by the pounding of her pulse. She glanced once more toward Phil, who now stood at the center of the stage with an air of calm completion. He looked genuinely content, unaware, or unconcerned that the woman he had just honored was seething quietly a few feet away. When the final applause ended, she rose from her seat, her every movement smooth but stiff. Harry followed, offering a hand she didn't take. Together, they made their way toward the exit. Cameras turned, capturing every step. She smiled for them, even as her eyes flickered with something colder. Outside, the night air hit her like a shock. The flashbulbs reignited, reporters shouting questions across the velvet ropes. How does it feel to win the award? Will there be a statement about the gala? Did you feel honored tonight? She smiled faintly and gave her usual answer. We're just so grateful to be part of something meaningful. But once inside the waiting car, the mask slipped. The door shut, muffling the chaos outside. For a moment, she said nothing. Her breathing was shallow, her gaze fixed on the darkened window. Then, softly but with precision, she said, "He did it to remind me I'm not royalty anymore." Harry said nothing. The silence between them was thick, heavy with familiarity. They had been here before, different places, different provocations, but always the same wound. "He knows who I am," she continued, voice rising slightly. "He knows what that title means." He wanted to make a point. To everyone. Harry exhaled. "He treats everyone the same. That's his thing." "Exactly," she said. "And that's the insult." Her reflection in the window caught the flash of another camera outside. She turned away, her expression softening into something between frustration and resolve. "If he wants to make a statement, so will I," she murmured. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the glittering lights of the venue. Inside, the silence stretched until the sound of traffic filled it. Meghan leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The anger hadn't faded. It had crystallized. Tomorrow, she knew, the story would spread. The images would circulate. And no matter how carefully the headlines were written, everyone would see what she felt in that instant, the moment the Duchess was treated as just Meghan. Back in the hall, Phil Schermer thanked the remaining guests and shook hands with the event organizers. Someone mentioned the Sussexes' early departure, and he nodded politely. "They must have another engagement," he said simply. His tone betrayed nothing. Later that night, when his communications team showed him the first wave of online reactions, he just smiled faintly. "We called her by her name," he said. "That's all." And in that single statement lay the difference between two worlds, one that demanded reverence, and one that believed equality meant standing without crowns. The photographs would tell the rest. In them, Meghan's micro-expressions told a story far louder than her words ever could. Pride wounded, dignity contained, and anger disguised as composure. It was the kind of moment the public would replay endlessly, an image of control breaking just enough to remind everyone that beneath the titles and speeches, She was still human, still vulnerable, still deeply aware of how quickly admiration could turn to indifference. By the next morning, that flicker of expression, the slight downturn of her lips, the faint glare in her eyes, would become the headline image of the night. The applause had faded, but the sound of her own voice still rang in her head. Meghan sat upright at the long table near the center of the hall, fingers pressed against the edge of her award, the cool glass grounding her as her thoughts spiraled. Every camera, every whisper, every breath of the crowd felt directed at her. She could feel the pulse in her neck quicken. The speech she had delivered moments ago had not gone the way she wanted. It had been meant to inspire, to reclaim control, to remind everyone why she and Harry were there. But somewhere in the middle of her words, frustration had slipped through. The audience had felt it. So had Phil Schermer. From the start, her speech had been polished, crafted carefully with her team. It was supposed to sound empathetic, filled with gratitude, and above all, dignified. But when she stepped to the microphone and looked out at that hall, filled with people who clapped because they had to, not because they wanted to, the script had begun to crumble in her mind. The lines she had rehearsed no longer sounded like enough. She began softly, her voice steady, her posture impeccable. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight is about connection, compassion, and courage. It's about removing the silence around mental health and replacing it with understanding." The opening was safe. Applause followed, short and respectful. But it wasn't what she wanted. It wasn't the reverent hush she used to command. Something about the audience's neutrality pushed her deeper into the speech, faster than she'd intended. She continued, her tone warm but edged. "I've learned, through my own experiences, that healing begins when we see each other as people, not as roles. When we listen, not to respond, but to understand." That line had been meant as universal wisdom. But the moment she said it, she caught sight of Phil Schermer standing to her right, his expression neutral, hands clasped in front of him. Something inside her hardened. The next words came out slower, heavier. "Titles, expectations, labels." She paused deliberately, the silence hanging in the air. "They can define us, but they can also confine us. True empathy begins when we strip those away." The irony struck her even as she said it. A murmur ran through the crowd, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone shifted in their seat. A few journalists looked up from their notes. The energy in the room had changed again. Harry stood a step behind her, watching the crowd's reaction with quiet unease. He had heard this tone before, the one she used when trying to steady her anger under the guise of grace. It was measured, articulate, but cold. She wasn't speaking to inspire anymore. She was asserting herself. She pressed on. "Each of us has a story that deserves respect. Each of us has a voice that matters. But when people choose which parts of us to recognize and which to ignore," she let her voice drop just slightly. "That's when empathy fails." A single cough broke the silence. Cameras clicked again. Her delivery was flawless, her words poetic, but the message was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. It was a reprimand, wrapped in eloquence. At one of the front tables, a woman leaned to her husband. "Is she talking about what happened earlier?" she whispered. He shrugged, not answering, but they both knew she was. Meghan went on, her voice tightening almost imperceptibly. "We talk so often about equality, about compassion, about treating everyone the same. But compassion is not sameness. It's awareness. It's acknowledgement. It's calling people by who they are and what they've worked for." That line drew a faint stir from the audience. A few pairs of eyes turned toward Phil Schermer again. He didn't move. His expression stayed calm, polite, unreadable. Meghan saw it, and it pushed her further. "When we deny someone recognition," she continued, "we deny a part of their story. We erase what they've carried, what they've overcome." Her tone softened, but the edge remained. "And I think, tonight, as we celebrate awareness, it's important to remember that awareness begins with respect." The room was still. For a moment, it felt like everyone was holding their breath. She could hear the faint hum of the sound system, the shuffle of a waiter near the back, the dull tap of someone's pen on a notepad. She ended with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. So, thank you for recognizing the power of compassion, for seeing not just what people do but who they are. That's where healing begins. Applause followed, louder than before, but uneven. Some guests clapped with genuine enthusiasm. Others exchanged awkward glances. There were even a few who hesitated before joining in, unsure whether they had just heard an acceptance speech or a rebuke. Phil Schermer returned to the stage, his composure unbroken. "Thank you, Meghan," he said simply. His voice was calm, unaffected. "Thank you for reminding us that every story matters." He turned back to the audience, ready to move on with the program. The applause faded as quickly as it had started. Meghan and Harry stepped away from the podium, back toward their seats. She didn't look at Phil again, not directly, but her body was rigid, her chin slightly raised. The tension in the room clung like fog. Some people whispered to one another as the next segment began. "Did you hear that? That wasn't just about mental health. She was furious. I think she was making a point." Phil continued the program with effortless professionalism. His tone never shifted. If the moment had unsettled him, he didn't show it. To him, perhaps it was just another speech. But to Meghan, it had been a battle. A subtle, coded duel fought with words instead of weapons. When the lights dimmed again for the closing presentation, Harry leaned toward her. "You were brilliant," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. She looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. "They'll say I was angry." He hesitated, then said, "Let them." Her gaze shifted back toward the stage, where Phil now stood giving closing remarks. His voice carried easily through the hall. "Titles, positions, achievements, they're not what define us," he said. "It's our actions, our empathy, and our willingness to be human." That final line hit her like a slap. She didn't flinch, but her breath caught. The crowd applauded again, standing now in appreciation for the host. The cameras turned toward the stage, capturing the moment. She clapped too, mechanically, her face perfectly composed. By the time the lights came up and the music swelled for the finale, Meghan's decision was made. She wouldn't let this moment define her. She would reclaim it in her own way. As they exited the hall, journalists swarmed the entrance. "Meghan, what did you mean when you said awareness begins with respect? Did you feel disrespected tonight?" She smiled, her voice calm, flawless. "Every event like this reminds us that kindness matters. I think that's the only message worth remembering." But inside the car, as the door shut and the noise fell away, her composure cracked. She turned to Harry, her tone low but fierce. "He used my own words against me." Harry exhaled. "He probably didn't mean it that way." She shook her head. "He did. That was deliberate." Her reflection stared back at her from the car window, calm, perfect, unyielding. "He wanted to remind me," she said finally, "that I'm no longer a duchess here, just Meghan." The car rolled through the quiet streets, headlights slicing through the darkness. Behind them, the gala continued, but its message had already shifted. What had been meant to celebrate compassion had become a study in pride, perception, and power, the night when words meant more than crowns. The atmosphere in the hall shifted almost imperceptibly, like a slow change in weather that no one could name at first. After Meghan Markle's speech, there was applause. Measured, polite, and perhaps a touch uneasy. The sound filled the room but didn't linger. It faded too soon, replaced by the scraping of chairs, the clinking of glasses, and the whisper of conversations that avoided the topic everyone was secretly thinking about. Something in the air felt off, a disconnect, an imbalance between what was said and what had been heard. The crowd had come expecting celebration, inspiration, maybe even a touch of royal charm. Instead, they found themselves processing tension. Some didn't notice it at first, distracted by the event's elegance. The candles, the soft music, the taste of wine. But others felt it immediately, the subtle stiffness that hung over the tables closest to the stage. The applause had been too short for such a high-profile moment, too careful for what should have been spontaneous admiration. It was as if the audience didn't know whether to cheer or to wait. At one of the back tables, two journalists exchanged quick glances. "That was interesting," one said under his breath. The other raised an eyebrow. "You mean uncomfortable?" The first nodded, lowering his voice. "There's a headline in this." You could feel the room change. It wasn't just them. The donors, the celebrities, the executives, they all felt it too. Something about Meghan's tone had unsettled them. She had spoken beautifully, but beneath the polish, there had been steel. Her words about recognition and respect had landed harder than she might have realized. People began to interpret the speech differently depending on